Hi everyone, I'm Sango Mahanty coming to you from Canberra at the Australian National University. It's a great pleasure to be here today and thank you so much for tuning in to this talk. I'd like to start by acknowledging and celebrating the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples on whose traditional and unceded lands I'm speaking from today, and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. I work with a group of political ecologists here in the Resources, Environment and Development program at the Crawford School of Public Policy. Several of us work in mainland Southeast Asia, and in the last decade or more, we've watched communities in the areas where we work fracture and familiar places become increasingly unlivable. Changes in rural society and environment seem to have intensified and accumulated. Most recently, my own work has been documenting some of these changes in agricultural frontiers along the Cambodia-Vietnam border. My colleagues have been working on a range of different areas: conservation failures, extractive activities involving timber and minerals, and also hydropower projects. We're a cheerful bunch. So it was in this context in 2017 that we developed our research project titled Rupture, Nature-Society Transformation in Mainland Southeast Asia, and gained funding for it from the Australian Research Council. The project is ongoing and it's being undertaken by a team of very engaged political ecologists. I'm sharing with you here a link to our project website and you can find details of our group there. My aim today is to share with you some key points from a paper that we're currently working on. The paper aims to flesh out this concept of rupture. What do we mean by rupture, and how does it expand or build on existing ideas of nature-society transformation? What I'm presenting is not exactly a group consensus, but more a patchwork quilt of some important themes and issues that we're bringing together and still thrashing out. It's very much a work in progress, and in the time available, I'll aim to give you an overview of some key points and really look forward to your comments and constructive suggestions later, because we're very much at a stage where we can pick up on ideas and suggestions that you might raise. In describing the kinds of intense and deep forms of transformation that I touched on earlier, we were drawn to the concept of rupture in Christian Lund's paper from 2016. Lund uses the term rupture to describe dramatic episodes of institutional and structural transformation, such as we might see during conflict, colonisation and revolution. Lund suggests that these periods make processes of state-making visible and also create new spaces of negotiation for material and political claims. So these episodes of rupture represent an open moment where the outcomes are uncertain and very much in play. Although our use of the term rupture was inspired by Lund, from the outset we had a broader application in mind. We wanted to explore this fractured world of the Anthropocene that we were seeing, with its cascading and intensifying processes of change. In the places where we work, these include major land use shifts, mega infrastructure projects, disasters catalysed by climate change, and usually combinations of these. So in these contexts, rupture is more than institutional disruption. Rather, we're seeing dramatic shifts in the status quo that cut across the very fabric of nature and society. With these ideas in mind, our research has set out to study these processes of rupture. We're using this term rupture in two ways. First, we use it to describe dramatic shifts in nature society. Some are observable and others are felt in less visible ways. Secondly, we're elaborating rupture as a lens or a heuristic through which to explore the textures and the implications of such transformations. And this framework comes out of a conversation between our conceptual and our empirical work. As political ecology scholars, we're quite used to studying the political and economic drivers of change in contemporary landscapes and the differentiated challenges that these present. In this research, though, we're trying to go beyond the quite well-studied question of why social and environmental systems are fracturing. Our focus is instead on understanding how change processes are being amplified through interactive synergies, and the lived experiences of change for those who are most affected. We're also interested in how rupture can enable or constrain new forms of agency, as well as new forms of state suppression and response. Our case studies are all hydropower dams in mainland Southeast Asia, but this is more than a study of dams. For us, these projects represent cases of rupture because of their transformative role within already changing landscapes and river systems. The first case centres on Vietnam's Black River to study two of the country's largest dams and their historical and geographic connections. The older Hoa Binh Dam and the more recently completed Sen La Dam are the two sites that we're working at there, and it's Phil Hirsch and Phuc Xuan To who are undertaking the research at those sites. The second case study looks at two connected dams along the Se San River system that traverses Cambodia and Vietnam. These are the Lower Se San 2 Dam in Cambodia, where I've been working with my colleagues Chan Supiak and Suong Sok Supiak. We've also had a photographer, Thomas Cristofoletti, working with us, and I'm drawing on some of his amazing work in today's slides. And the second site there is Se San 4, or Ya Li Dam, in Vietnam's Central Highlands, where Phuc Xuan To is leading the research. The third case examines two related dam sites in Cambodia's Cardamom Mountains, the now suspended Areng Dam in Koh Province and the Atai Dam in Persat Province. Tim Frewer and Sarah Milne have been collaborating on the field research at Atai, and the work at Areng was undertaken by Kelpi Seth in collaboration with Sarah. And then finally, we're very lucky to be able to draw on Keith Barney's very long history of work at Hin Bun Dam in Laos and Phil Hirsch's extensive knowledge of the Thai and regional context. All of these projects are in frontier settings or post-frontiers where major land use transformations were involved. In all cases, Indigenous peoples were living in the dam-affected areas, and all of these occur in authoritarian or illiberal settings where these are countries that are governed by one-party states in the case of Vietnam and Laos, or de facto one-party states in the case of Cambodia. The four themes that I'm going to focus on today, as I mentioned earlier, are conceptually and empirically informed. And collectively, they exemplify the kinds of dynamics that we consider to be important in the settings of rupture that we are studying. And these are scalar interactions, synergistic processes of change, temporality, and agency. I'll go through these in turn, but they are very closely related, as you'll see from my discussion points, and I'll also illustrate these with examples from our case studies. Let's look first at scales of analysis and interactions across scale. Geographical scale is often explained in terms of hierarchical or nested systems of social organisation. Scholars such as Eric Swingeroo remind us that these levels of social organisation are not fixed or given. Instead, economic, political and social hierarchies are socially constructed, and they're continually being made and remade. Social groups and classes, whether we're thinking of elites or subaltern groups, may occupy different scalar positionings, and they may actively use scalar strategies to gain power in different contexts. For example, Swingeroo and also Glassman in his 2002 paper examine how local actors can jump scales, forming alliances, for example, to oppose state or internationally driven neoliberal interventions. In the context of hydropower, a scalar lens deepens our understanding of the strategies that social movements adopt and how these play out from the local to the transboundary level. Louis Lebel and his colleagues show that social actors can be quite adept at working with scale in these hydropower projects. They may constrain, create and shift between levels to serve their respective interests. In addition to exposing scalar politics of the kind I was talking about, seeing scale can also deepen our understanding of social and biophysical relationships. Consider this map of dams in the Mekong region prepared by the Stimson Centre and their collaborators. It's only by scaling up to this regional level that we can get a sense of river systems at risk. So our analytical choices in relation to scale are very important in making certain processes visible and therefore making them targets for governance. In his recent paper on Mekong hydropower, Phil Hirsch finds that national and regional scales of analysis have often been privileged over local levels of analysis. The local commons that people use for their everyday needs and as safety nets during times of stress can be rendered invisible by these scalar choices. This means that local needs and local commons can be excluded from the analysis or perhaps treated superficially in governance interventions. So in understanding rupture, our scalar choices are significant. Regional or national analysis can tell a particular kind of story, perhaps a spectacular and catastrophic story as a prompt to action. If we look at this map again, seeing the number of dams that are planned, under construction and already operational in this region, for me anyway, inspires a sense of panic, rather like the notion of the Anthropocene or global processes of climate change might. Yet these higher order analytics often are founded in and prioritise technocratic knowledge, which, as we know historically, has tended to serve state power, while deprioritising local or customary knowledge. So I'm not saying that these higher order levels of analysis don't serve a useful and important purpose. But really this is about being mindful of the fine-grained stories, the local stories and transformations, such as the case of this Benong elder and his explanation of why he and several other members of his community refused to resettle. They actually did resettle from their original village, which was flooded by the dam reservoir at Lower Sesan 2, but they chose not to go to the new resettlement village, instead occupying some of their customary land closer to their original village and closer to the edge of the dam reservoir. And his explanation revolved around choosing land, their customary land, and his existing way of life over the monetary inducements of resettlement. So often this fine-grained level is where stories of agency can be witnessed, even as they jump and connect across scales. So Hirsch argues for a reprioritisation of local commons in our assessments of hydropower schemes. And this is important more broadly in Rupture, to make visible civil society and local voices when higher order levels of analysis tend to emphasise statist and international imperatives. In our research, we've chosen to start from the local level while we still examine interactions across scales. This brings us to the next and related theme of synergistic processes of change, where different developments might interact to intensify and expand the scope of change processes. This is not a new idea for political ecologists. For example, critical agrarian studies have long examined the synergistic nature of change processes that are associated with rural market formation and intensification. Interactivity has also been taken up in more normative or policy-oriented approaches, such as the food, energy, water nexus. Hydropower assessments often overlooked the trade-offs and impacts across related areas of food security, energy provision, and water governance. So the food, energy, water approach advocates for a more integrated analysis across these three spheres in planning and decision-making processes. In practice, this framework has tended to be applied in quite technocratic ways, and it can fall short in its attention to social dynamics. Cumulative impact assessment is another important approach, particularly in the hydropower sector. In the Mekong, there are examples of such assessments organised by the Mekong River Commission that examined transboundary issues at the level of river systems. And this is certainly a welcome shift from assessments that focus only on individual dam sites, which are problematic in all sorts of ways. But the approach could go further. Writing on Lao hydropower specifically, Keith Barney and Ian Baird advocate for cumulative impact studies to also consider how dams interact with forest lands and resource access. In Laos, all of these spheres are integral to the diverse livelihoods of rural people. But these cross-sectoral relationships are typically left out of hydropower assessments and planning. At the Hinboon Dam, for instance, Keith Barney has documented how local livelihoods have not only been squeezed due to dam displacements, these stresses have then been intensified through synergistic interactions with land enclosures for forest land development schemes, as well as population resettlement schemes. So these kinds of synergistic transformations that serve to intensify pressures on landscapes and communities really exemplify the dynamic of rupture that we're interested in. So cumulative impact assessments typically speak to a particular snapshot in time or decision-making processes, but interactive changes can unfold over a longer duration. In the case of Atai Dam, there have been cascading longitudinal changes. The dam itself was built in 2013 with a flurry of large-scale timber extraction during the construction period, which seems to be part and parcel of dam construction in Cambodia. But by the time my colleague Tim Frewer started working there in January 2020, dam construction was a distant memory already for the original villagers. More immediate were the land transformations that were set in train by the dam, the expanded road networks, the migration and tourism that followed the dam also opened up the area for market crops. Land was rapidly acquired by wealthy investors for crops like banana, pepper and fruit trees. And this in turn brought further settlers and seasonal labourers. Another recent development in this area is a RED project, which further squeezes the ethnic Chong community's access to land for swidden cultivation. Similarly, the Sun La case illustrates interactive changes over time. The dam was built between 2005 and 2011, and during that time, Indigenous Thai villages were resettled. In 2008, the Vietnam Rubber Group came into the picture, introducing rubber with support from a national poverty alleviation program, so also a policy interaction going on there. And they used a contract farming model to get villagers to cultivate rubber on their resettlement lands. These contracts had the effect of fixing the land under rubber production and effectively prevented the villagers from growing other crops, which they desperately needed to do because the price of rubber slumped in this last decade. The villagers have fought back. For instance, they've tried to plant fruit trees on these rubber lands as a way to reclaim some of the land for other uses. But so far, it's kind of a situation of entrenched conflict, and the company definitely has the upper hand, having the ear of state officials. The outcome here, apart from the conflict, has been quite high levels of debt among villagers, and many now, especially the younger generation, are seeking off-farm income. So in these cases, we see that while dams in themselves have dramatic environmental and social consequences, it's these synergistic changes playing out over time that seem to have deepened rupture. And these were connected by location, by land and resource access, and have played out over time. Sometimes already displaced communities have been exposed to multiple displacements and multiple forms of exclusion over time. This brings us to the third and closely related theme of temporality. To observe the spatial and material transformations that I've been talking about so far, we're applying an implicit timescale. So time is central to our understanding of environmental and social change, to our understanding of rupture. But such changes are not only smooth and linear. They may occur through discrete and sudden events, or there may be rhythms and timetables operating, for example, in the way development trajectories unfold, rhythms and cycles within nature, or from the standpoint of different actors. Different actors may also bring different forms of social discipline around time and mark time in different ways. And I'm drawing here on work by May and Thrift back in 2003. So it's important to understand temporality in terms of social and cultural conceptions of time. And I'm drawing also on a paper here by Adensor and his colleagues from 2020. Recent work on slow violence adds that our temporal lens can make different processes of change more or less visible. It can privilege certain perspectives or interests over others. So again, drawing on the Adensor paper that I mentioned earlier, if we think about the geological timescale of the Anthropocene, thinking about time over this very long duration can render invisible local and lived experiences of change, and so can detract from the immediate concerns that people are enduring day to day. So our choices about temporal lenses are quite consequential. In the context of environmental and social rupture, how can we account for these fluid and relative ideas of time? One approach we've been using is longitudinal analysis to pick up on the slower and interactive processes that can contribute to rupture over the long durée. And this was our aim with the Huabin Dam case. The dam was built between 1979 and 1994. And Phil Hirsch was involved in some of the early social assessment processes there. So we had a picture of how things were in the early stages of dam planning and construction. At the time, the Muang and Da villagers living in dam-affected areas were given land in areas that were quite remote and lacked water. So they found their own land and effectively resettled themselves at the edge of the reservoir, closer to water. Over time, several processes of change have impacted these communities, from the food shortages of the 1990s around the time of decollectivization, migration by new settlers in the last decade, and new forms of market engagement, such as cage fishing on the reservoir, among others. So although the initial transformations from the dam were dramatic and relatively rapid, subsequent processes like migration and land conflict have served to intensify those effects, and also expanded or intensified social differentiation over the last 20 plus years. So these interactions show an important longitudinal dimension that needs to be considered in understanding rupture, where changes interact and intensify over time. But change can also be sudden. If we think of the case of the Lao Dam collapse in July 2018, when the Sepian Senamnoi Dam in southern Laos collapsed that year, the disaster was widely covered in the media, and you might recall some of these news stories that I'm putting some examples of here on the slide. The collapse devastated villages in the Sepian Valley, and the flood then spread out over a much larger area of Atapo province. In the neighbouring Cambodian province of Stung Treng, the river level rose to 11.5 metres within just a couple of days. Houses and farms were inundated and some areas had to be evacuated. Even as far downstream as the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, farmers observed an unusual flood pulse. So in understanding processes of rupture, what is the role of these sudden and discrete disasters and events? Chloe Arman's recent paper on slow violence and social action provides some useful insights here. She writes that specific crises or moments of rupture, she also uses this term, can incite action and bring contradictions to light. So she's writing on how pollution can inflict violence on bodies in ways that are incremental and accretive rather than sudden and spectacular. And you could compare that to sort of the slower process of resettlement and dam construction that took place over several years. But then we see with the dam's sudden collapse that the vulnerabilities and risks of these affected groups has been brought home in a very striking and disturbing way. Arman calls these sudden episodes moments of moral punctuation because they dramatise situations. They explicitly mark time in a way that condenses protracted suffering and calls for an immediate and ethical response. They provide a sense of urgency. So her work examines how these kinds of moral punctuations can also inform social movements. I talked earlier about scalar strategies and jumping scale, and Arman draws our attention also to temporal strategies. These have actually been quite prominent in the hydropower context, both as a means to exercise control and to resist it. A good example is the Areng Dam in Cambodia's Cardamom Mountains. The dam was put on hold by the government in February 2015, in part due to local resistance, or as the headline here says, to silence opposition. Similarly, the government announced in March 2019, that it was putting plans for mainstream Mekong dams on hold for 10 years. The largest of these is Sombor Dam in Karachi province, which has raised a lot of concern about the scale of impacts that dam will involve. But what does on hold mean? The state leaves open the option to proceed at a later stage, introducing uncertainty and the possibility of future or threatened disruptions, creating what's known as Damocles projects. On the activist side, groups also engage in temporal strategies. For example, when I asked a Thai-based NGO worker about what success looks like in an anti-dam campaign, she shared that delaying commencement of work was an important strategy in itself. The delay created space for something to change, whether this was a shift within government, for additional campaigns to be launched, or perhaps even for the company to decide that their investment might be best made elsewhere, and they just move on. So this politics of incrementality and deferral, as Arman calls it, is relevant for both the powerful and for the marginalised. These examples serve to highlight that we need to think about temporality to understand processes of rupture as well as responses to rupture. We need a flexible and perhaps more spacious temporal concept than a focus on single episodes or single events. I'm going to return now to the notion of rupture as an open moment or a space of negotiation. I've already touched on some aspects of local agency in the preceding discussions on scale, interactivity, and time. There's a large literature out there on dams and social movements, and our work will definitely add to this, particularly in the area of networking between local and broader scales of action. Today, though, I'd like to focus on a less studied area of agency, which is its connection with emotions. Let me start by explaining my use of this term. Recent work often distinguishes between affect, the visceral or unconscious forces within us, and emotions that can be known and experienced at a more conscious level. Sarah Ahmed, in her book The Cultural Politics of Emotion, questions whether such a clear dichotomy is useful or meaningful. Instead, she studies emotions in terms of social and cultural practices, rather than getting caught up with how we define emotions or what emotions are. Like her, I'm interested in this nexus between emotions and social practices. Ahmed also suggests that emotions are not only individual, but can take on a collective form. Consider the raw emotions that we've been seeing in the Black Lives Matter protests. And finally, Ahmed flags the role of symbolic objects, especially for collective emotions. These ideas are especially relevant when we're looking at settings where loved and familiar places are being permanently transformed. Australian researcher Glenn Albrecht and his colleagues documented the role of emotional responses such as individual and collective grief when familiar environments are changed forever. And they call this this kind of grief over lost and changed environments, solastalgia. Oftentimes in the communities where we worked, emotions were very close to the surface. And I'm going to run through a few examples here. The Indigenous Thai villages affected by Sơn La Dam were closely linked to each other through kin ties. And the move impacted these relationships in ways that were still grieved and remembered many years later. Also, more than a decade after the dam was built, villagers still held very strong attachments to their old village. An elderly man said that he still dreamed of the old village quite often, even though it was now many metres underwater. He shared, "Every time I passed the location of the old village, I cried. I'm still afraid of passing this area as I cannot control my emotions." Another villager said, "The most heartbreaking moment for us was when we had to demolish our houses before moving. The houses that sheltered us for many decades. We all cried desperately when we had to do it." In another example, at Lower Sesan 2, we used visual methods to discuss the emotional experiences of resettlement. Through discussion with some NGO colleagues, we designed a focus group activity where we used a set of about 120 images that were collected from a range of different sources, and these were pictures of symbols of nature, people in different situations, objects, rituals, and we had focus groups with men, women and young people where we placed these images in the centre of the group, and people were invited to select up to 3 images that spoke to what was going on in their lives right now, what was alive in them right now. And then they were invited to share something about the pictures that they had selected. This image of a waterfall was selected by one of the women. And although we had invited people to select up to 3 images, she very carefully only chose one. And she shared that when she saw this picture, it made her think of the old village, where there used to be a waterfall with rocks like this. "I miss it," she said, very simply. And no one spoke for several minutes after she had shared her story. And the atmosphere was really heavy with her sense of loss. And perhaps it was the first time she'd had an opportunity to really articulate that emotion in this way, which in itself was powerful and I think important. So the materiality of change has these very deep emotional dimensions that we need to acknowledge. This was an expression of grief. And historically, we haven't been very good at dealing with these feelings of grief, as Leslie Head writes about, that fall outside material supports or compensation, which are the usual focus in these dam resettlement projects. In this case, her grief was being dealt with at an individual or perhaps a family level. And I'd like to contrast that with the case of Old Kabarumia, the group that refused to move to the new resettlement village that I touched on before at Lower Sesan 2, where emotions such as anger seem to be really significant in fueling community opposition to the dam and their refusal to move to the resettlement village. So one of the community leaders that was very involved in the activism against the company and government shared, "We were determined and angry. Even when we were freezing from cold, we worked together to push out the company people with their trucks and bulldozers. We walked towards them as a group and made them reverse out. We told them that wherever they left their equipment, we would burn it unless they left our land. After resisting their move away from customary lands, the community has gone on to claim around 7,500 hectares of land under the Indigenous communal title provision of the Cambodian Land Act. They may, in fact, get a smaller area of around 500 hectares, and this is under active negotiation with the provincial government. And although that's a much smaller area than the community had applied for, it's very interesting because it comes from an earlier situation where they faced imminent eviction. And so we've seen this kind of concession on the part of government or recognition of their claims in some way. And at the same time, there are other community building activities underway in this village, often with NGO support, but at the same time, shared identity, shared Benong identity, which is the Indigenous group there, and commemoration of their joint and fierce struggle are quite central to this. They've also made a point of, rather than demolishing and using materials from their flooded homes, they're choosing to leave the flooded village as it was, they say, as a memorial to what their community has gone through, and their determination to stay in the area rather than to resettle. So I'm coming to my last slide now, and I'll try and draw some of these threads together. As you'll notice from the connections that I've been making to a range of other literature, we're not proposing something radically new with this concept of rupture. We can all relate to this at some level. Certainly in Australia, after our fires, closely followed by hailstorms and flooding in the early part of 2020 in southeastern Australia, and then COVID-19. The concept of rupture seems very apt for these large-scale and cascading changes that are becoming increasingly common in our lives today. When I talk about our project on rupture and our current research, people can really relate to that as a concept and an idea, the idea of dramatic environmental and social disruption. What we're interested in here is how the concept can help us make sense of people's lived experiences of change, its interactive nature across scale and across related change processes, as well as its temporality. I've talked about the spaces of agency that people might be finding in these particularly settings of quite constrained political rights, and what might motivate this at an emotional level, for example. So the novelty here perhaps lies in bringing these different analytical elements together. I'm really interested in whether some of these themes and dimensions that I've been discussing today resonate with any of your work, and I now welcome any comments and reflections that you're able to share. Thank you very much for spending your time with me today.
Thank you so much, Sango, for that talk. It's a really fascinating project. Before we get started with questions, would you yourself like to say anything?
No, Amber, I'm actually really keen to hear any questions and comments.
Right.
I might just mention that I had an error on one of the slides. The one where I was talking about Hua Bin, I think the caption mentioned Sen La Dam, so I just wanted to point that out. But otherwise, I'm just really keen to hear any thoughts and questions.
Okay, thanks. Nathan, you've been monitoring the chat. Do we have any questions yet?
Yeah, we have one question so far from Graham. Graham, you want to unmute yourself and ask the question. It's about metabolic rift.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. Well, thanks very much for that talk. I really enjoyed it, and it's certainly brought to life the problems which I think we've all known about damming rivers and the kind of ecological consequences they have. What was going through my mind when you was talking was the similarity with this notion of rupture, which I think is quite a useful concept, and the more Marxian concept of the metabolic rift. I don't know if you've heard of the term before. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about the relationship between the two, or are they indivisible? Are they basically the same thing?
Yeah, look, I think when we were doing our initial review of kind of related ideas that were out there, definitely metabolic rift was among them. And
Uh-huh.
I think that speaks very much to kind of the drivers of these processes of rupture, kind of capitalism as, I guess, a driver of change in these environments, and the breakdown between human relationships to nature, in a sense, and overuse of resources. So yes, there is a close relationship. I guess, yeah, I mean, I would probably think about metabolic rift as, yeah, a driver or a cause for these processes of rupture. And then what we're trying to elaborate more is kind of how these ruptures take form and how people are navigating them, in a sense. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, or whether you'd like to add anything there.
Graham, I think you're muted.
Yeah, you're
Oh,
muted, but no.
hello. Yeah,
Gotta
I
love
mean,
Zoom.
I agree. It really confirms what I was thinking when I was listening to your talk. So, it's all good stuff.
Thank you.
I have a question from Molly Chapman. Molly, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nathan. Thanks so much for your talk. And I'm kind of curious about any thoughts you have about values. I study environmental values, and in particular relational values, and the kind of connections that people have to places, to practices, to ways of life and being, and how that kind of contributes to having a good life. And so you talked a little bit about emotions, and that made me think it's also something I've been trying to grapple with and trying to understand these sort of the relationships and the emotions and the values and how they might all fit together. So I was just wondering if you got into that at all, or if you had any thoughts about how people cope with the loss of these relationships, these two things that they value deeply, and are they able to translate that to new places, or is something kind of forever lost there?
That's a really excellent question. I haven't been looking into values, or we haven't been looking into values specifically. Sorry, can people hear me? Yeah, okay. But I think that's something that we probably need to think more about. I mean, I guess I'm not all that familiar with the literature on kind of values and connections with emotions. So if you've got any particular recommendations, I'd be really interested to hear about that. I guess we sort of approached it more at the level of emotions, because it's something that's, I guess, present and easier to get at in a way. Yeah, but I'd be interested to know more about what you've been exploring around values, or if you've got recommendations around some of the literature there that would be really useful to us.
Yeah, I haven't really found a good connection between values and emotions. It's sort of, I keep hearing, in my interviews, I work mostly with farmers. Emotions come up a lot in association with values. So it's still, but I think there must be some sort of important connection, but I don't really know what it is. Yeah, and so your study just made me think more about, like, how do these fit together and how can we make sense of them?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And you also mentioned in your comment earlier that are these people establishing connections to the new places that they're moving to? And I guess, people are establishing connections in some way, but there's still this real sense of loss was what seemed to be coming through, which was very enduring as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I would say the connections seem quite different, and very different livelihoods, and relationships to land seemed very different because, as I mentioned at the beginning, the case studies that we've been working on all involved Indigenous communities in the dam affected areas. So I would say the relationships are being probably renegotiated, but in quite different ways, to the ties they had to the places that they were displaced from. But yeah, really, the whole question, thank you, something to think more about.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we had a little flurry of questions with 3 questions lined up. The first one is from Melis, but she hasn't written her question, so I'm going to invite her to ask it. Melis, would you like to unmute yourself so you can ask your question?
Hi, thank you, Nathan. Sorry, I didn't write my question. Actually, I have many questions, so I couldn't decide which one to write. So I'm just going to go over very quickly. Thank you very much. I mean, this work resonates a lot with what I did on a eviction from a national park. So I just want to point out there's a lot of, you know, connections with that issue, conservation eviction issues. So I did my work in Senegal from Niokolo-Koba National Park and evictions from there, and that reminded me a lot of that situation. And what actually made me think about is also what I looked at in that you know, example is was also the whole process of resettlement, which was very important. Like it turned out to be very important in that case. And obviously, you know, there was a question here about whether rupture is an event or a process. For example, from my, you know, study, really eviction was not an event. It's really a process that takes a long time. And you also talked about like there were several layers of, you know, evictions, which exactly that's what I saw also. People being evicted not one time, but quite a few times. One thing I was just curious is, you know, I understand the connections with the land and nature is central here in the concept of rupture, but what I saw also from my research was that the connections among the kin groups was also important, because the people who got evicted from the national park were, I don't know if we can make any kind of similarity or not, but they were, they had a particular kind of exchange relationship. So they had not only kin relationship, but they exchanged certain types of goods, and they had in the hierarchical relationship. And when they got evicted in the new areas, they were in a way subsumed in another kind of authority relationship. So and their own relationship with their kin groups also changed. So I'm just putting it to you. I mean, how much could that be also a factor maybe in your study? And I was also wondering a little bit about the place, this feeling of loss, and which is related to a bit to place attachment. And one of the very important things that came up in my research was the religious aspect. And I haven't heard much about it in your talk. In my case, there were like tombs that they left in the evicted places, and they had a specific, you know, I guess importance, especially heightening this like kind of emotion of loss, which links them to their ancestors, basically. That was really key. And the third question I'm finishing is the use of photos. I'm wondering, can you, I mean, what is in your opinion, like the impact of using photos that they did not take, somebody else took photos, and, you know, what kind of like, you know, effect does it have on the establishing emotional associations? That's about it.
Thank you. Those are three really great, meaty questions and comments that I'm going to keep thinking about, but I've got a few maybe points I can make in relation to those. On the point of about social connection, definitely. So if I relate that to I might speak to the case study that I know best, which is Lower Sesan 2. So when the resettlement was initiated there, essentially the village was of Old Kabal Rumia, which is one of the villages that I was working at, was almost evenly divided about taking up the resettlement package or versus remaining, or not remaining in the village, which was submerged, as I mentioned, but resettling themselves to a location near there, which was still on their customary land. So it was certainly not just about ties to land. What was happening in that process was this community was essentially torn apart over the question of resettlement. And it was a trauma, really, because within families there were disputes. That elderly man that I'd spoken of before kind of described how, his children or nephews and nieces really wanted to go, and he was really angry, and he said, all right, if you're going to go, then go. Don't come back here and ask me for help later if it doesn't work out, sort of thing. So there was a lot of conflict within the community, and that was really deeply felt, and it was one of the I guess it was a really important aspect of the rupture, which I didn't really talk about in the presentation, but it was very important. In terms of the religious aspect, which is, I think, also important, I haven't, again, I didn't talk about it, but one of the issues that was raised quite a lot in Old Kabal Rumia, the village, half of the village that stayed behind, was proximity to their burial grounds as well, similar to what you described. And particularly, I think in the older members of that community, this seemed to be an important issue for them. In terms of the photos, I think you're asking about the photos that we used in that focus group. Is that right, Melis? So basically, I think that's right. Like the idea, just to give you a bit more background, it was a really interesting exercise, and the first time that we had tried it. And it came out of discussions with a colleague who works on LGBTQ issues in Cambodia. And he's doing actually some really exciting work. He's Khmer and was trained in Australia, actually, in development studies, and then became an artist. And so he uses visual methods a lot in workshops to try and help people engage with and talk through issues that they're going through as they come out, for example. And his suggestion was that by using photos that are not of the place, but that represent kind of symbols or kind of things that maybe take people out of their immediate setting, that it can have kind of an interesting dynamic to it. It can raise different sorts of ideas or feelings. So it was very much an experiment. We actually found in the end, when I sort of did the photo selection, it was done quite rapidly, and I would have liked to consult more and spend longer on it. But in the end, so I did get some photos that would have been more culturally familiar to people, and some that were quite different. For example, that photo of a waterfall was from a different country altogether. And I think in hindsight, using images that people might be more familiar with, they did sort of tend to gravitate more, I would say, to photos of nature or kind of Cambodian images around rituals and that kind of thing. Because especially in a rural area, we talked about, he would use images from all over the world, but to our thinking, it seemed like it would be very unfamiliar and unworkable almost to present really foreign images. So, I mean, it was an experiment, and I think we've learnt some things from it. Alongside that, we've had a photo voice, kind of another experimental bit of field research going on in the near Atai Dam in the Western Cardamoms, in a community called Osam. So that was Tim Frewer was working on this, and he basically did the setup for that. For that work, we were drawing on some advice from Vietnamese colleagues that had done similar photo voice research in the highlands. And yeah, he got to a certain point, and then COVID-19 hit, and he wasn't able to get back to. He's really excited to see what comes out of that. So that is quite a different process, because it's kind of asking people to document with photographic imagery things that are significant to them that may have changed over time. You can focus photo voice around different sorts of themes, and we were particularly interested in the theme of change. And so the process is that people take a photo and they work with the researcher to kind of document stories around the images that they've taken. And I think that's also a very powerful way to look at it. And we don't have that data yet, but I think it will be interesting to see what comes out of that.
Thank you very much.
That's okay.
We have 5 more questions lined up. We only have half an hour left. So thank you all for all of you who've asked questions. If you could, when I invite you, if you could keep your questions fairly short and to the point, and maybe pick the most crucial question, if you have more than one, and I'll try and get through everybody. So I have one is from Benjamin Nymark, and they were asking about the concept of rupture, something to do with temporality of rupture. Benjamin, could you?
Yes. Hi Sango.
Ben.
How are you doing? And on a UK time zone, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, and Amber and Nate for hosting the event. Clearly, I'll keep it really short. Clearly, the concept of rupture is attractive, right? And it as theorists and probably policy and state, I mean, you would probably be quite could see the concept as being attractive, and I'm thinking it's probably attractive due to its definable sort of temporality, right? Its ability to sort of pinpoint a moment where you could say rupture might have happened. And clearly through your talk, and political ecologists more generally would rather not think about it this way, as Melis has mentioned, that these probably are historical and multiple events, which lead us to a particular, probably a kind of continual rupturing. I'm wondering if you could speak through that tension really quick, and sort of, you know, help us as a useful sort of heuristic here.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. I think that's another really good question. So this is something that we've been kind of grappling with as well. I guess the point I was trying to make in the talk, that it is, as you were saying, that rupture does have both of these temporal dimensions to it. The kind of longer term, slower processes of change that are interacting over time, and the sudden kind of transitions that can bring risks and I guess the extent of rupture to light. And I'm thinking, as you were speaking, I was thinking about COVID-19, because it's been said quite often in different commentaries that I've read that COVID-19 has sort of laid bare all of these existing systemic inequalities and injustices that were going on already, and yet it's kind of quite a sudden event. And so I think, to me, that's sort of how I see the relationship, that you have got these ongoing processes, these interactive changes going on that are progressively deepening stress in landscapes and communities. But then you can also have these sudden shifts that occur that kind of draw our attention more, perhaps, and they're quite easy to identify and kind of attract more urgent forms of action. I guess that was the story that I was trying to tell with the dam collapse. But actually the two are quite closely related. The sudden event doesn't come from nowhere. It's certainly in the case of the dam collapse. And the sudden event serves to expose these deeper changes that are going on. So to my mind, they're really closely related. How you communicate that to a policymaker, that is a really good question that I don't have great answers for at the moment, but something for our little group to, Keith, to think further on. Yeah, but just, I think that's a really important dynamic that we've been trying to explore, and I think temporality is one of the more interesting aspects of this framing that we're trying to come to grips with. Thanks.
Okay, there's another question from Rico de Faria, and this links to the point about implications for government. How receptive were governments to your findings, and how receptive were practitioners to your findings? Do you want to add anything to that? And if you unmute yourself, then if you want to elucidate on the question a little bit briefly, that would be.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Greetings from Vienna, Austria, where there are no kangaroos here. The question really is, because of our work, we're not specialists in dams and all that, but more on the rupture or disruption side and transformational change. One of the issues we find is that the links between scientific research, policymakers, and practitioners is very often not there or not a top priority, which means the relevance of whatever practitioners do or scientific researchers do may not have the impact on overall society as we would like it to have. So there's a certain gap, or I don't want to call it wastage, because it's never wasted, but if things could be made more effective. So my question really is about that. How were governments involved really, or just an occasion? Practitioners, were they somehow interested, or did they not know about it? We know about civil society because you've explained quite a lot about that. But thanks for any answer you can give.
Thanks. Thanks for that question. I mean, I guess the context that we're working with, as I sort of mentioned very briefly, are not kind of Western democratic systems of government. So in the Cambodian context, I would say it's easier to have conversations at the local government level. So, you know, we in the field, one might talk to village heads or commune officials, for example, even up to the district level. It's kind of easier to have exchanges at that kind of local government level. The problem being that that's kind of not necessarily a key level for decision making about some of these major infrastructure projects. When it comes to national government in a place like Cambodia, it's quite difficult to gain a hearing for some of these findings. You know, I'm being quite honest, quite honest here. I don't know if I've got some of my colleagues around. I don't know if they'd like to comment on the particular countries that they're familiar with. For example, Keith, in the context of Laos, I know there's been a lot of dissatisfaction about how the compensation and fallout of that dam collapse has played out. It's not easy to kind of gain the ear of government, I guess, is what I'm saying in the context where we're working. If any of my collaborators would like to add to this, please please feel free. I see Phúc still here as well, on the Vietnamese context. Put you on the spot there, didn't I?
Yeah, I guess I could say, I sort of posted a cheeky comment here on asking my own collaborator a question. So yeah, I would say that, and this also goes back to one of the first questions on, what was it on metabolic rift. So I would be a little bit hesitant to, place what I'm thinking of anyway, solely within sort of a Marxist metabolic rift framework, I think, because I see lots of ways in which, dams as a particular form of development that is associated with, particular social programs and priorities around resettlement that sort of escape beyond a capitalist logic, that the interests of the authoritarian state are also really much in play here. And how this, in the case of Laos, there's a much longer state history of interest in population resettlement and hydropower projects and their associated compensation and mitigation schemes and irrigation programs that all these sort of ancillary hydraulic infrastructure that becomes attached to hydropower schemes, that is also sort of part of this sort of centralizing state building authoritarian process that is happening in each country, but in different ways. So in the case of Laos, it's the most extreme case where there's just a very a civil society that is really sort of under the pressure of the government. There's really not much space for civil society activists to be directly voicing concerns around things like the dam collapse that Sango mentioned. The small number of local activists who have raised concerns around this. One young lady has been given a long prison sentence for even minor Facebook posts on these issues. So, Laos is a bit of the extreme example. There's much more civil society activism happening in places like Thailand and to some extent Cambodia. Now, even Vietnam there's quite a bit going on. So the different countries have different combinations of state civil society relations that influence how sort of our ideas might be able to be taken up by different actors.
Yeah, thanks for that, Keith. I don't know if Phúc wanted to add anything there or whether we have time.
Okay. Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So sorry. I should have my video on as well. So this is Phúc, and I'm working with the group or focusing on Vietnam case study. I would like to respond to Vico's question regarding our communication with the government or with the private sector. We have been communicating with the government regarding the negative impacts of the hydro dams in Hòa Bình and Sơn, and we have been communicating with Vietnam Rubber Group, giant state-owned rubber company, establishing large-scale rubber plantation in the northwest of Vietnam, where the solar hydro dam is located. So we also have been engaging with media agencies in Vietnam, introducing them to the area where large-scale rubber plantation is established, so that they can be more informed about transformational changes on the ground associated with dams, hydro dams, and rubber plantation. And we also talk with local NGOs in Vietnam. So actually we have been quite actively engaging with different stakeholders, including the government, private sector, and NGOs in Vietnam in communicating our initial findings with them.
Right, thanks, Phúc. So that gives you a bit of an overview of the different country contexts and kind of state-society relations and how that frames how the research can or cannot have any purchase with government actors, I guess. Nathan, should we have the next question?
Okay. As we're running a little bit short of time and we have a few questions, I'm going to I'm going to read out the questions that we've received rather than taking turns, because I think that might save a little time. And then we'll hand over to Amber at the end to wrap up. We're aiming to finish by past. The first one is from Lucy, and she says, there seems to me to be something about decolonizing approaches to wealth and poverty. SDG Goal 8 is about economic growth and eliminating poverty. And in your talk, you said that the government tried a poverty alleviation strategy in giving the resettled villagers employment on the rubber plantation. But their way of life seemed to become poorer through this, something about seeing wealth and poverty through more than simply economic lens, and what this means for global socio-environmental goals, for example, the SDGs. I'll just read this set of questions, perhaps, Sango, and then you can respond. Is that all right?
Okay, sure.
Are you able to?
Yeah, I'm taking a few notes.
Great.
Yep.
And the next one is from Sreyang, who asks, across cases, I would like to know more about the role of civil society or NGOs in the process of rupture. This is because civil society themselves are divided. And then the following question was also about civil society. It's from Rosie. What's the response to the affected areas in the wider populations? Is there support for opposition without a direct connection to the land itself? Do you find civil society groups unifying behind each other, even if the issue does not directly affect their own specific cause? So that's two very related questions. And that's it. I think that's probably just time to answer those questions.
Okay, thanks. And I think Keith answered his own question, so we can leave that one aside. Thank you for those questions. I'm going to kind of broadly, I'll deal with two. So there was one about kind of the ways in which we think about development in economic terms, and the second one was about civil society, but various aspects of how civil society is engaged in these settings. So in terms of ideas of development and the need to decolonize these, definitely, I agree with you, and yet we're dealing with situations where states do have these ideas around modernization, and large infrastructure projects seem to be such a central part of that. Kind of how we get to that point of opening up the concept of development so that local aspirations and values, as I think Molly was talking about before, can play more of a part. I think that's the big challenge here. So I think you've flagged a really important issue. But I guess, there's no easy answers to that. Definitely it's something those of us who work in development have probably been grappling with for some time. In terms of civil society, I could probably speak to the Cambodian context particularly here. So I would say that civil society played a really important role in, especially, for example, the resistance to resettlement. It was a really interesting story in Lower Sesan too. There was a particular person, an individual, a leader within a NGO that was kind of based within that province, who had built up networks at the village level through some past work that he had done at the very time that the dam was kind of under active discussion and planning. So that relationship kind of allowed a lot of information to be shared about what this dam will mean for people. How do dams look? What sorts of effects do they have? And that kind of thing. So civil society played a really important role in helping to inform people and helping to organise kind of resistance within those communities that were being directly impacted. Later, what emerged there, and Ian Baird has written about this, was that NGOs kind of splintered off into different, positions in the resettlement process. So some were much more closely affiliated to government and tried, I guess their approach was to try and get the best possible resettlement package for the people that were being displaced, rather than actively resisting the dam or the resettlement process. So then what happened was that the NGOs that were kind of working on resettlement and for a better resettlement package were at odds with the NGOs that were helping communities to kind of resist resettlement and resist the dam. So you can get this splintering around kind of more state-affiliated NGOs and NGOs that with a focus more on Indigenous rights and human rights, which was, I guess, the standpoint that the ones who were actively supporting resistance were coming from. And I think it's been difficult for those groups to reconcile over time. And yeah, so I guess sort of the picture in Cambodia where there has been a reasonably historically active NGO or civil society sector, but there's also been a big clampdown on that by the state, and so now it's becoming more difficult for those groups to have a very prominent anti-government stance. And talking to some of these civil society actors, they were really reflecting on how are they going to operate in this new kind of very tight control of civil society sort of environment in Cambodia, as new dams or other kind of rights related issues come up going forward. So I think those were the two main areas that I was asked to speak to. I think, Nathan, do we have time for another question, or do we need to go to Amber now?
Hi, I think we've got one last question on the chat. Can you do one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so one last question on the chat.
One from Elliot Hurst.
Yes, go ahead, Nathan. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Perhaps I'll read it out again just to. How are the tangled temporalities of rupture viewed by the Indigenous people who have been involved in the field work? How has this concept been refined through engagement with local people?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really interesting question as well. So in fact, so I'm sorry that I keep drawing on my own field research when in fact we have a large number of case studies and field sites, but I guess it's the quickest way for me to respond. So for example, in the Lower Sesan 2 case, that was the interactions we had with people there were really instrumental for me in my thinking about temporality. We did in our focus groups kind of a timeline exercise, which is a very linear kind of way of thinking about the temporality of change processes in that area. And what people were communicating, just as an example, was first of all, like we came in sort of wanting to talk about the dam and the resettlement process. And one thing that came up really early in discussions was, well, it all started long before the dam. It started when they started to sell land, and they were referring to these economic land concessions that were being, these are long-term leases that were being given away to Khmer and later Chinese companies. So in their mind, like the dam was already kind of, it came later. Already there was this major timber extraction and plantation development going on in the area. And then secondly, another interesting kind of temporal point that I can recall as an example was this idea that the dam, when we think about it, it takes quite a long time from the planning stage to the point where the dam is actually operational. It was probably about 10 years or so in the case of Lower Sesan 2, or longer. And people were describing this as, oh yeah, there was a lot of kind of discussion and stuff going on. We were taken to see this place for resettlement and do this and that. But actually, kind of these 2 years were the hot period, was kind of how they described it. And so for them, it was kind of, it was an emotional way of describing it in a way. It's like this is where a lot was going on and we were really kind of stressed and engaged in kind of resisting things or having to make choices, and there was conflict. So I think those are just a couple of examples of people's temporality around these things, and kind of it really made me question my own idea about temporality. We think about a dam as kind of almost in the same way that you might think about a discrete event, but actually it is a process that unfolds of planning and implementation, and within that people were identifying kind of really intense periods as well, and as well as making links to change processes that were already underway. Thank you.
All right, we're just running out of time. Thank you so much, Sango, for your talk and for answering the questions. Thank you to everyone who's been in attendance and for all the great questions. Thank you so much on behalf of the center, and we really appreciate your contributions to our themed year on natures. Look forward
Thanks
to...
everyone, and thanks very much Amber and also Nathan for organising this. It's been really helpful for me as well.
Yep, and if you're interested in more exploration of these themes, there's actually going to be a double session around these themes.
Of course.
Called In Placing Crisis, Theorizing Nature Society Transformations at the virtual Pollen Political Ecology Network 3rd Biennial Conference in September. So just to plug that. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.